learned so much if you've been on the J's analysis ride. A lot of you guys are new. I understand. That's cool. Glad to have you here. But some of you have been with me for the long haul. In fact, there are some who've been with J's analysis for 10 years, reading it back in the day. And we've come a long way. We've come a long way. All right, welcome. Thank you. Glad to see you all here. We got a room of almost 200 nerds. I'm sure the nerds will pile in. Maybe we can get up to about 300 tonight. We'll see. It's your boy, Jay, in the house. Your boy. Can't see me. All right, welcome. And if you can, try to avoid those clicking in the background, David.
Yeah, I will.
All right, welcome. You are here in another episode of Jay's Analysis. Today we have our good friend, our brother, David, the real Medwhite, back. David has delved deeply into the Chalcedonian issue, the issues of Pope St. Leo and the so-called Oriental Orthodox. We're going to look at that today. We're going to get into the topic of how the notion of hypostasis in nature is part of the confusion, how there's a development, you could say, in the understanding of those terms. We're not saying there's a development in doctrine, but there is a development in which terms will become precise in our theology over time. And David has done a lot of research into the actual writings of those in the opposing camps. And now this is relevant because there's a lot of a false ecumenism in our day, which assumes that, oh, well, all these positions are actually just the same. We're all saying the same stuff. So there's no reason to fight anymore. And anybody who debates or fights over these issues is unloving and mean and has spiritual problems, which would mean that everybody at Chalcedon was unloving and mean and had spiritual problems because, of course, they were debating these issues. And then for the next 200 years and the next two councils, it's actually the issues of Christology that get hashed out and debated, particularly the topics we'll be discussing today. We're going to cover a lot of those formative central texts. And David has done, three-part series? I think I've made it through at least half or two of the three of your talks. Really good stuff. So let's get into this today, and I'll have David's link here up in a minute for his channel. David, how you doing?
I'm doing great, Jay. This stream, some people might remember that we did the stream on Orientals as well. It was on Florence as well. But what's going to be different about this stream is we're going to be diving more in depth. That stream was kind of dealing with the common misconceptions. This stream is going to be explaining pretty much the in-depth Christology of Severus of Antioch, Philoxenus of Mabog, and other Oriental characters. And again, the reason why I even started doing this is it didn't sit right with me when I heard so many people say, oh, for 16 centuries, for like all this time, we were actually believing in the same exact belief, but we just had terminological problems. And I saw a lot of different argumentations from Copts, which made me say, okay, I'm going to look into this. I'm going to research and see what both sides say. And the theology is really not the same. And when I made the video series, which, by the way, if you want to watch, like, you can watch in any order. Like, if you want to start with part 3, if you want to start with Diophysitism in the Fathers, that's fine. Right? You don't have to, like, watch it chronologically. When I started to upload the videos, one interesting thing that happened is that various different Coptic priests have said that I don't really understand these issues. They said this on Facebook. I don't really understand these issues, but none of them really explain how I don't understand these issues. And one of them, at least, when they were pressed, they start to explain a little bit, but they showed that they had no idea what they were talking about. So it really just seemed like, oh, has no idea. He thinks we're different, but we're not. And this was back when I only uploaded like the introductory part. So we're going to be talking about.
Why are they always arguing? Yeah, why are they always arguing against us? By the way, if what we say is not different.
Yeah, exactly. A lot of them, like the way they act, a lot of them act like we had many people that were part of the Oriental Communion, and we asked them who their bishop were in the Discord server, and none of them they didn't really want to say it. So there's a sentiment, especially between the laity, that like, oh, we really are the same, and the clergy are too. They don't care enough to actually talk about this. Peter Farrington, he says that he studied this for 30 years, and he says that we're not different. But we don't accept Chalcedon because they don't say the magic words.
Exactly.
So the stuff that we're going to be talking about is going to be dealing with the history. We're going to be going back to even 428. I'm planning on giving like a short summary of what happened, because this is all going to be very relevant for people to understand what's going on. So as we probably all know, they have a character called Nestorius in 428. He becomes Patriarch of Constantinople. He says stupid stuff like Mary is not the mother of God and all that stuff. St. Kirill starts reading the Fathers, and one interesting thing to note while he's reading the Fathers is that he comes across, and this is important to note, because this explains why the term meaphysis even came into play. Now, of course, if you watch the first part, we say that we don't do the word concept fallacy. The concept behind those words is what matters. So St. Cyril reads certain Athanasian letters, when in reality they were written by Apollinarius, and there are various different people that make note of this. Timothy, in his ecclesiastical history, who's an Apollinarian disciple, says that the term meaphysis was made by Apollinarius in order to combat the innovation and heresies of the Cappadocian Fathers and of Saint Athanasius and all these different people who, in their eyes, are preaching two natures. So I think this is kind of important to note. But he came across this term when he was researching about the Fathers, and he thought it was genuinely from Saint Athanasius. Now today, we know that it's not from Saint Athanasius, it's Apollinarian forgeries. But it's important to note because this is really how the term comes to play. Then First Council of Ephesus happens. There's an Nestorian council. There's a split between Antioch and Alexandria. This is very important because 2 years later, in 433, there's a formula of reunion. There's a reunion between Alexandria and Antioch, two patriarchates that have different Christologies. And one interesting thing, and this is in letter 39 in St. Cyril, that's going to be very relevant when we're talking about Pope St. Leo, is that he says that we know the theologians make some things of the evangelical and apostolic teaching about the Lord common as pertaining to the one person, and other things they divide as the two natures and attribute the worthy ones to God on account of the divinity of Christ, and the lowly ones on account of his humanity. So this is very relevant because Pope St. Leo says the exact same thing in his tome, but this is not acceptable for them. And we're going to get into how they defend this from St. Cyril. And then St. Cyril argues against, after the reunion, he argues against Theodore of Mopsuestia. In the Fifth Ecumenical Council, we condemned him as a heretic. And he writes on the unity of Christ. He reposes. And then other stuff happens. So there's a council in 448 under the presidency of St. Flavian. He deposes Eutychius. And then a year later, Dioscorus says, oh, no, I have to save him because he doesn't teach. Oh, he was rejected out of because of a Nestorianizing patriarch. So Ephesus, the second council happens. St. Flavian, Ebas, Theodore, Dominus II of Antioch are all deposed. A year later, St. Leo is excommunicated. So Dioscorus, in one fell swoop, just excommunicates and gets rid of three major patriarchs and other patriarchs as well. And so this is a big deal, right? This is a huge issue that's going on. And this context is important when we're talking about the Council of Chalcedon. And in 451, the Council of Chalcedon happens and begins. And on the topic, by the way, Jay, on the topic of all we believe in the same thing, if you look at the Troparia, if you look at the Troparia of Severus from the Coptic liturgy, what's really funny is that they refer to us as heretics. They refer to Chalcedonians as heretics. But now today, 16 centuries later, suddenly we believe in the same thing, even though in their liturgy they refer to Chalcedonians as heretics. Don't you think this is like absolutely silly? We believe in the same thing, but apparently we are heretics. How exactly? But so what are the Oriental problems in the Council of Calcutta? If you watch the part 2 of my video series, I deal with that argument extensively. So one problem they have is that you first said that Christ is out of two natures, and then you inserted into natures, right? And that's one of the arguments they use to say that there's a direction going to the way of Nestorius, because he said the same thing. So this is an example of word concept fallacy here.
Yeah.
Nestorius used into natures. Therefore, we cannot say into natures. And as a matter of fact, Severus, I believe St. Justinian cites Severus in saying this. St. Justinian says that he makes a point that Severus argues that, when the Father spoke of two natures, that was fine. But then came Nestorius, and now it's not fine. So Nestorius kind of poisoned the term in their eyes. And this is a great example of just the word concept fallacy, genetic fallacy. But the main problem with the Tome of Leo, there's two problems. The one problem is that Pope St. Leo talks about forms operating and seemingly independently in their eyes, right? So he speaks of two forms of Christs, and they think that those two forms of Christ means two persons. The problem with that is because Pope Saint Leo has a Western understanding of Christology,
Right.
forms mean essence. It doesn't mean hypostasis. It doesn't mean
Right,
anything
and
like
this is
that.
you
It
see
means
this in
essence.
Augustine. Augustine does the same thing in his sections in the City of God, where he cites the Platonists. He cites God as the first form, which actually is a mistake in Orthodox theology. Augustinian theology is actually incorrect here, but it backs up what you're saying, because Augustine is using form in the sense of essence or nature, and there's a whole chapter in Bradshaw's book on that, which backs you up.
Exactly. And if you want to add, I used this quote in my Chalcedon video. Saint Gregory of Nyssa, he says the human nature does not give new life to Lazarus. So that itself, if Saint Leo said this will be deemed as heretical. But this is Saint Gregory of Nyssa against Eunomius that says this. And then there's another quote from Pope Saint Leo in his tome where they argue, he asks which nature was on the cross. Well, actually, Saint Gregory of Nyssa again in against Eunomius asks which form is beaten in the passion and which is glorified from eternity. So he's talking about the human form, meaning the human essence, was beaten in the passion, which is exactly the same thing that Pope Saint Leo says. So again, these are arguments that Orientals use, but the responses are fairly simple. So again, I'm keeping it simple. If you want the full explanation, you can look at part 2 again. So about letter 39 of Saint Cyril, Severus and Philalethes. This is text 4 Philalethes. So if you have, this is from the Pauline Allen book on Severus of Antioch, text 4. Severus essentially says in his defense of Saint Cyril, talking about dividing, quote unquote, dividing Christ's actions and attributing the divine ones to divinity. He says that he actually didn't mean it. I'm not kidding. He says, he didn't mean it. He just made them anathematize their positions, and then he said, he just let them prattle on like stupid kids, and he didn't actually mean it when he said that, which is, again, an example of rationalization in our view, and it has really bad implications on St. Cyril's view. I mean, if St. Cyril didn't really mean what he said, doesn't that mean that he is fine with Nestorianizing ideas? Won't that imply that he will be fine with Chalcedon because he didn't mean what he said? Again, this has bad implications for him. Another big issue they have is that Chalcedon accepted Ibas and Theodoret, which are two Nestorian sympathizers. Now, in terms of Theodoret, if you actually read his book Eranistes, which was composed in 447, there are numerous things that he says in Eranistes, which is actually the things that St. Cyril says. I'm not going to go over them, but again, I'll deal with those things. And with Ibas, he has a bad letter about how he doesn't like St. Cyril, but he doesn't really speak of theology. Not to mention, his acceptance was based on a reversal of the Council of Ephesus II. So it was based on reversing the effects of the Second Ephesian Council, which Chalcedon was based on. And not to mention, again, his letter where he was condemning St. Cyril was written in 433, back when he was a priest, not when he was a bishop, back when St. Cyril himself was alive. And there's another example of word concept fallacy, Jay. They will say Nestorius accepted the Chalcedonian Council. He said, I believe in the same thing, which is funny. I mentioned this in the video. Arius does the same thing with the Council of Nicaea 10 years later.
Yes.
He says, I accept the Council of Nicaea. So
yeah,
is the Nicene
that
Council
was
Arian?
a great point that you made. I mean, just because someone claims to accept something, that doesn't mean that the council is therefore erroneous. I mean, that's a ridiculous argument. And by the way, Basil in his writings is constantly having to deal with the word concept fallacy. We deal with it constantly as well with idiots like Jonathan Hill, who will say that because the term natural theology is used in St. Maximus, therefore he means natural theology in the Thomistic sense, which is ridiculous. I mean, Bradshaw has entire sections refuting that notion. Father Staniloy has entire sections refuting the notion that we believe in the Thomistic version of natural theology. So again, word concept fallacy is at the root. It's a central problem here in this debate with the non-Chalcedonians, because they're married on the one hand to the phraseology of St. Cyril. When St. Cyril was himself not married to one definitional sense of this terminology. This is the problem with all of these heretics and all these people who don't have any ability to understand nuance, is that they try to squish everything into a one-dimensional notion. And once they do that, in their minds, they think they've got some kind of key to refuting everyone else, but it just actually makes them look ridiculous.
Not to mention, it's the same Jonathan Hill that sided with the Coptics.
Right, yeah, he'll side with Coptics. He'll find anybody who's in a disagreement with us to try to find common cause, because he's psychotic. By the way, he's bipolar and he's on meds.
And not to mention, to prove that St. Cyril wasn't married to one phraseology, there's letter 53. There's his statement on Glaphyra on the Pentateuch. But letter 53 is very insightful, because he says Christ is in and out of two natures. So he says exactly what Pope St. Agathos says 2 centuries later,
right,
who also says that Christ is in and out of two natures, which is affirming the both formulas, right? Both formulas that St. Cyril uses. So we're actually not divisive. We're actually accepting the correct interpretation of both formulas. Really, the main debate is rejection of the Diophysite formula, which is, by the way, patristic. And this is, again, as I proved, Timothy, the student of Apollinarius himself, admits this. And another objection I've seen, and this is a silly objection, the word hypostatic union was not used in the Council of Chalcedon. Therefore, Chalcedonians don't believe in hypostatic union. I mean, can you really believe this?
Yeah,
like, this is the sort of argument these people
so many stupid arguments. I mean, this is like, you had some really good comebacks on this point in your videos, by the way. I think that was solid argumentation, absolutely.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it also shows, right? Like, the way people defended Chalcedon, it's not like they didn't appeal to a certain patriarch. They defended it on the grounds of its theology, which is very important. Now, I want to talk about, this is kind of like the basic issues in the Coptic Church. When I'm talking about the responses, I didn't make up these responses. Like, I heard these responses from other Coptic and Oriental Christians. So one response I've heard is about unleavened bread, and I think you can explain this as well. So the Armenian Church uses unleavened bread. The response I got, Jay, is that, it's merely a jurisdictional preference. It's not that big of a deal. Can you explain to me, Jay, why it's not merely a jurisdictional preference, why it's such a big deal?
Well, the ancient canons actually forbid doing that, and it would be a movement back to Judaizing. It would be a movement back to the Old Testament conceptions. That's the reasoning why in the early canons it's not that practice is forbidden. So, and this is exactly why Armenians would do things like sacrifice a chicken at the door of the church on whatever ceremony, because this is they're tempted with Judaizing. That's why.
Yeah. There's another objection I heard, the cousin marriages in the Egyptian church. The argument I heard was it's merely cultural, so it's okay. But I heard a good response from my friend Nick, who said marriage is theological, right? You can't separate marriage and just make cultural marriage and theological. Like, you can't separate these two. These are two intertwined things. So it wasn't really enough. But by the way, for the Orientals, I mean, these aren't arguments that are like, they won't really 100% directly prove, this church is wrong. It just showcases certain problems. We'll get to the real issues really soon. And there's the circumcision in the Coptic Church. As a matter of fact, if you look at Florence, Bull of the Union with the Copts, this is their motivation for saying that those that are circumcised are damned, because people in the Coptic Church did circumcision. And as a response, the Roman Catholic Church said, if you do circumcision, you're damned. Bull of the Union with Copts.
This was already condemned in things like Trollo and the canons of Trollo. The canons,
exactly.
Yeah, this was already condemned by us as well.
Exactly.
It's just ridiculous. So, like, how are you going to go back to these practices which the New Testament obviously forbids, the ancient church forbids? Obviously, and by the way, they are ecumenists. This is another point that is often forgotten, is that they will team up with Roman Catholics against Orthodox. They will team up.
They do it all the time.
Yeah. So they don't actually agree amongst themselves, these Oriental communions, but they'll team up against us with people who are far worse, like Roman Catholics.
Yeah, I see this genuinely. I've seen multiple apologists just refusing to. Now, to their credit, I've seen certain people, one of them who I'm debating with, he actually does represent the position faithfully, and he does attack like Roman Catholics as well, Protestants too. But most of the people that I talk to, they only focus on Orthodox. They don't even talk about Roman Catholics. They only focus on Orthodox, and this has to be noted. There's like really online, there's a lot of Oriental groups, and most of these are like Western converts. Most of them are catechumens, and all they do is they're just trying to find like inquirers to the Orthodox Church, get them, and just bombard them with, oh, Chalcedon is an Nestorian. Here's this, and this. Like, you guys are Nestorian. You should come to the true church, and they do this a lot. But that has to be noted. To get on to the real stuff, this is the beautiful stuff, the theology. First, I would like to talk about terminology. I'm going to dive much deeper into terminology. In part one, I kind of went like very basic. So one thing we have to make sure, and I will avoid saying the word nature as much as I can unless I'm quoting someone, because for us, nature obviously means essence, right? It means essence. For them, it means hypostasis, and in some cases, it means essence as well, but only in terms of Trinitarian theology. So in Severus's letter 65, he says that we use the name nature sometimes generally of essence, and sometimes specifically signifying the hypostasis of a man, and he goes on. So generally speaking, he uses nature to mean essence in triadology because the Cappadocians did this. But in Christology, he used a different scheme. He used a different terminology. So we will be talking about that. Now, of course, hypostasis for them doesn't mean person necessarily, because there are two types of hypostasis. It itself means a concretization of essence, and that's like the antique, like Nicene language that they inherit. There's two types of hypostasis. There's non-self-subsistent hypostasis, which is something that a hypostasis that doesn't exist on its own. So the example of this will be the body. The body without the soul doesn't exist, right? So it needs to be in a union with the soul in order to exist. And the soul, in this example, is self-subsistent. It exists on its own. So when it's separated from the body, the soul still exists, right? So it's self-subsistent. So these things are very important to note. And the body-soul analogy is very important in dealing with Christology. It's key
Right.
to this. And there's a structural similarity. For example, Nestorians will essentially say that all hypostases are self-subsistent. So that's why, like, when they're speaking of two natures and two hypostases, and they're trying to make a union out of two hypostases, because they're self-subsistent, it still leads to two persons theology, right? So this is like the basis of St. Cyril's argumentation, is that you can't really have a single personhood in a union of persons, in a prosopic union. For Severus, prosopon, person, will mean self-subsistent hypostasis because it exists on its own. And there's a very so in their Christological scheme, Christ is out of two hypostases. There's a divine hypostasis, right, that's self-subsistent, and there's a non-self-subsistent human hypostasis, even though normally a composite human hypostasis is self-subsistent. Because the humanity of Christ doesn't exist outside of the union, it's non-self-subsistent. So this might raise a common question, a very simple question. So Christ is out of two hypostases, and he's one hypostasis, and it's composite. Doesn't that mean that he changed, or doesn't that mean that there's a fourth person in the Trinity? Actually, no, it doesn't lead to.
Yeah,
but
only if you mistake the notion of what nature and hypostasis is.
Yeah, so the way they will defend it, they will say, well, self-subsistent is personhood, right? And so the humanity is not self-subsistent. There's no personhood in his humanity, but his divinity is where his personhood is, because that's self-subsistent. And so that's how they can still defend that Christ is still a divine person. But there is indeed a problem with that. And there's two problems, actually. Number one is that this kind of subverts tridological language. So from one nature, three hypostasis, it becomes one ousia and three prosopa in order to defend like the divine personhoods in the Trinity. But also, remember, the soul is self-subsistent. So this is something that Joseph Farrell talks about a lot in his book, God History. He asks this question like 3-4 times in his book. And he asks, what is, is soul and hypostasis, are they synonymous or are they distinct? The reason why he's asking, again, the soul is self-subsistent, and its union with the union with the body and the soul will mean that the soul will mean the personhood. So won't this lead to a direction of Apollinarianism? Is an argument that Joseph Farrell uses. And I think if you are to defend Christ's personhood, Christ's divine personhood, then necessarily in that same system, it will also lead that personhood is a faculty of the soul as well in that system. And that will lead to some sort of Apollinarianism. Not exactly, but the same mistakes Apollinarius makes. So this will be like the basic problems that Severus faces in his Christology. Do you have anything to add, or should I move on?
No, you can go ahead.
Okay. So there are also other arguments. Some of these I already used. This one is from Leontius of Jerusalem. So the distinct formulas that we have is that we say that Christ is in two natures and out of two natures signifying the singleness of his personhood, in two natures signifying the duality of his essence, duality of his essences, duality of his energies, right? Duality of his wills. So these are the two formulas that we use that are in perfect conjunction with one another. Now, the Orientals, they reject the into natures formula. For them, it is a Nestorian formula, because to say into natures, for them, nature means hypostasis. So that means, you mean into hypostasis? Someone might ask, well, what if they said nature meant essence? We will get to that, because that actually happens, and we will see how Severus responds to that. But there's a common argument here: is if Christ is out of two natures, out of two hypostasis, but he's not into natures, but at the same time the natures are not mixed and they're not confused and they're distinct, right? So after the union, Severus will speak of them being. We'll speak of proprieties, right? So what propriety is, it's kind of distinct from property. It's the color of Christ, like eye color is a propriety of the human hypostasis. Height, weight, right? These are like natural qualities.
Yeah, what you see here is also similar, I want to stress too, to the tendency of Apollinarianism, which what Apollinarianism did was to mistake characteristics of what are proper to human nature, different features and faculties or properties of human nature, to mistake that for what hypostasis is. Hypostasis is also not just the combination of all of the characteristics of human nature. So the nature-person distinction is crucial here. As St. John Damascus says, all heretics result from a failure to distinguish between nature and person. All of the heresies, all the Trinitarian, all the Christological heresies are based on this, which is based on dialectics. And we're going to see that dialectical tension in most of these guys that we talk about, especially Severus with his dialectical usage of Aristotle. But what I wanted to stress is just that there's an important distinction between the characteristic properties of a nature and what a hypostasis is. And this is this mistake that many, many people make, including people in Orthodox circles as well, who just simply aren't studied on this or don't know the nuances of this topic. And it's very nuanced.
So the main argument here from Leontius, I'll cut it short, is, so you say Christ is out of two natures. That's fine. That's good. But you say that his natures are also distinct even after the union. And Severus will say, yes, of course they're different, right? They're different, right? His humanity is different from his divinity. But then the obvious objection here will be, so they're distinct, but doesn't distinction mean multiplicity? Should that mean that after the union there's still two natures? And again, if the problem here is that Severus wants unity of nature, unity of hypostasis, out of two hypostases. But the problem is, again, if you're going to try to say that they're distinct even after their synthesis, even after the union, the problem is distinction implies multiplicity. It doesn't imply division. It doesn't. In their view, it does. But in our view, we will say it doesn't imply division. But it still has to be distinct. And if it is distinct, then there needs to be two natures even in that logic. And this is actually the argument Leontius of Jerusalem uses in his book Against the Monophysites, where he tries to argue, well, you still should be arguing for two natures because this is the logical conclusion. And a debate which we will get on later, but the debate that Severus has with Julian of Halicarnassus is actually very much based on this question. It's very much based on whether distinction causes multiplicity or not. There's another proof of Severus of Antioch, of Severus of Antioch believing that distinction implies division, and that is letters 22 and 23. I will focus on letter 23 in this instance, but he says in this letter that that there is a Holy Trinity that is divided and distinct in hypostases, but it is not divided in one essence. So what he's trying to say here is that he's really trying to protect the Cappadocian theology, but because he believes distinction implies division and composition, something we talk about all the time, he has to say that the hypostases are divided in the Trinity. And we won't say that he's willingly being tritheistic. I don't think his intention is tritheistic, but nevertheless, it may lead to tritheism. It does anticipate tritheism in his theology if you actually understand the implications of the hypostasis being divided. But what I wanna focus on again is that for him distinction implies division. Now, to get onto the debate that he had with Julian of Halicarnassus, this is very important because Julian is an Aftartodokatist. He believes that Christ's humanity was impassible along with his divinity, and he believes that the natures had a non-different difference. So in Greek, this was diaphora adiaphoros. So he says, the humanity, they are distinct, but at the same time, they're not really. And his argument was that he understood that distinction implied division. And he understood in the Severan system that Christ had distinct conditions, right? In his humanity, he was passible, but in his divinity, he's impassible, right? So there's two distinct conditions that Christ has. And so he thinks that, well, this necessarily means that the properties are divided because they're distinct. And that will lead to division of natures and persons, which leads to Nestorianism. And then this is the rationale that Julian has in accusing Severus of Nestorianism, ultimately because Severus is trying to be orthodox in his system by saying that Christ is passible in his humanity. But ultimately, Julian actually tries to be consistent with that system. And he says, no, actually, that is not possible, because if there's a distinction, that means division. That means there's a division. That means there's a duality in Christ. That means there are two natures in Christ, and we can't accept that. And so this is an example of a debate that he has. I think we will get onto that, if I'm certain. Yes, we will get onto that debate later when we're talking about energies. This is text 11 in the Severus of Antioch book by Pauline Allen. This is text 11, so you can go read there for yourself. I'm not making this stuff up. I read the text. I know what they're talking about. Now, there's another debate that is important, and this is relevant to into natures, meaning into essences. So there's John the Grammarian. He is what we will call a Cyrillic Chalcedonian. So he's one of the first Cyrillic Chalcedonian theologians in the scene, and he defends Chalcedon, and he the theology that he proposes is the theology, generally speaking, that we use today. He's different from the person of John Philipponus, by the way, who's a different person. They're both called John the Grammarian, but this John the Grammarian is not the same as the philosopher John Philipponus. So this debate is very insightful because John the Grammarian has a very simple argument. His argument is essentially basically this. Look, all we did in the Council of Chalcedon is that we have the Cappadocian Trinitarian terminology, right, where nature means essence, hypostasis means person, right? We have this Trinitarian terminology with us. All we did is apply that terminology to Christology. And so when we say into natures, the only thing we're really saying is that Christ is into essences. That's really what we're saying. And so since you too also believe that Christ is into essences, you should accept Chalcedon. I mean, the argument is very simple. And this is also vindicated because we just spoke about this. St. Leo also, form meaning essence, right? So this vindicates St. Leo as well. So Severus has two options here. He either accepts the argument of John the Grammarian, and he says, well, if it means two essences, then I guess you guys are right. I guess you guys are really not that different from us. Or he can reject it. And as a matter of fact, what he does is he precisely does that. He precisely rejects into natures to mean into essences. And so this will go to everyone who thinks that Orientals have the same theology with us. Severus had the possibility to speak of into essences in Christ. So basically how we view the into natures formula. And he explicitly rejects this. This is in the third letter in Against the Grammarian. You can find this also in the Pauline Allen book on Severus of Antioch. I believe this was text 8, but don't quote me on that. I'm not 100% too certain. But his argument, okay, why does he come to the conclusion that into natures means to a heretical conclusion? Well, his argument, it showcases his inverse ordo theology. So he says, we understand substance, we understand essence to mean a compendium of hypostases. So if in Christ two essences were united, then the problem is that these two abstract essences were united, meaning that the entirety of the Trinity and entirety of humanity was incarnated. This is nonsense. So this is the argument that Severus gives. The funny thing about this argument is that Nestorius uses the same exact argument against Saint Cyril. When Saint Cyril says that God the Word assumed flesh, let me find the exact part. Nestorius answers, if God the Word became flesh, then all the Trinity must have become flesh, since the Trinity is bound together as one nature. So this is the exact argument, and he means nature to mean essence. He used the same exact argument as Nestorius did a century ago. And again, this showcased the inverse ordo theology because you can only come to this conclusion that these abstract essences are united in our view if you start your theology with essence. Now what will be our response? What will we say if we came with this objection? We will say Christ possessed the fullness of the divine essence, but that doesn't mean that when he entered into a specific mode of being, that doesn't mean that the Trinity also entered into that specific mode of being. So he possesses the fullness of the human essence, but that doesn't mean that when he does something, when he enters into the mode of being, the Trinity, it also goes along. The same with humanity. So two natures, two essences can come into unity, but it doesn't affect the rest of the hypostasis in the sense that the rest of the hypostasis don't become hypostatically incarnated with Christ. But this is a very basic level mistake that Severus makes. And again, not many people really talk about this. And this is the one chance that anti-Chalcedonians had in trying to understand our theology, and they completely rejected this. And so for all the ecumenists on both sides, this completely refutes the project that some people are trying to go to. Do you have any comments, Jay, or should I move on to a mistake Severus makes about humanity being an energy?
Yeah, I mean, again, we're going to see the constant pattern of mistaking characteristic or properties of nature. So for us, body, mind, soul, will, and energy is the signifier or operation proper to a certain nature. So when a nature acts, we can know it by its energy, St. Basil says. So, for example, when Basil argues for the full divinity of the Spirit, he does so on the basis of the fact that the Spirit has the same uncreated energy as the Father and the Son. Anybody who's read Basil's works knows that that was a central key argument as to how he proved the full divinity of the Spirit. So we're going to see this same pattern, and Epistle 38 of Basil, I would add, is very crucial to understand. I'm not just saying for you, but for this whole debate, because it's St. Basil and the Cappadocians who will take us in the direction that the later fathers at Chalcedon, at Ephesus, Chalcedon, and Constantinople 1 and 2, 2 and 3, they will build on this theology. So our theology is going in a consistent direction where nature, person, will, the properties of nature that apply to human nature, body, mind, soul, will, those terms will become very precise and consistent in our theology. Energy will be very consistent, right? Basil will argue the same thing against Eunomius. I just want to stress that for us, the Cappadocians are crucial here. And I think that it's very important that even though Severus and certain people will cite the Cappadocians, I don't think that they really do them justice. And some of the Orientals even seem to question the Cappadocians, don't they?
Yeah, I'm not going to name the website, but there's an Oriental website that refers to like heresies to be refuted. And one of the heresies that we have is essence energies distinction. So they think that essence energy, like there's one website that is coming up, that's the Coptic website, refers to essence energies distinction as heretical. So yeah, there are some people that do that. A response I got that was good is apparently Severus, in some instances, does apparently distinguish essence and energies, but and we will actually get something relevant to that later, like right now. But again, the significance of this debate that he had with John the Grammarian is that a lot of the arguments John the Grammarian used was really talking about the Cappadocian Fathers, right? He used the Cappadocian Fathers and used him in a Chalcedonian way in order to debate against Severus. And I don't know if it's this letter or a previous letter against John the Grammarian, but I think Severus refers to him as a Nestorian atheist Jew. I don't remember like what exact terminology he used, but he like threw a lot of insults to John the Grammarian. So this wasn't actually just like a minor dispute that he had. Like he was very passionate about these theological differences. He said that John the Grammarian was an Ammonite that was foreign to the laws of Israel, basically implying that like his church is Israel.
Right.
So yeah, like he's like this isn't just something that like Severus wasn't like, oh, this is what I think, but I might be wrong. No, this is something that I really do believe, and if we have a different point of view, then you're a Nestorian atheist Jew, and I really hate you. Like this is the kind of view he has for this. So he's very adamant on protecting this view, which the same we cannot say for the Coptics today. The same we cannot say for some ecumenists, even in the Orthodox camp today. In this regard, we can't. I at least, even though he's referring to our side, I at least admire the passion he has for his beliefs in that sense, because I wish I saw that passion in other people, but instead we see ecumenism. But speaking of Severus, there's an interesting part in God History Dialectic. This is in the volume 1 PDF. I don't know if the pages are different in the book itself, but this is in page 223. Joseph Farrell says that Severus used the term energy in two senses, right? So he does have a doctrine of energies. One, as the source of activity or operation, and two, when he explains how the humanity itself is understood to be the operational energy of the deity within the incarnation. So to vindicate this, there are three sections. I'm going to read only one of them, but there's three sections in Severus's letter 1. This is to Ecumenicus, where he actually says this. So this is letter 1 to Ecumenicus, Severus of Antioch. He says that if then the word changed the manhood which he had hypostatically united to him, not into his nature, for he remained that which he was, but into his glory and operation, and things which manifestly belong to the flesh have come to belong to the Word himself, how shall we allow that each of the forms performs its own act? So he's referring to the Tome of Leo, obviously. But again, three instances in the first letter, he says the same thing, how the humanity is the operation or energy of the deity within the incarnation. So in the next page, Farrell says, 234, this entails two disturbing implications. Number one, is humanity energy of the deity of Christ in the sense of the actual process of the deity's operation? By extension, is creation itself therefore God's energy? And therefore, did God have to create, as occurred in the Origenist problem? Or, this is the second point, is the humanity but the object of the operation of the deity? Does the humanity not become, to use Severus's own words, a piece of wood or flint to be pushed about here and there? Or to use St. Augustine's words, a lump to be moved about by God from one state to another? As such, does God will at each and every moment to be fearful in his humanity, etc., and etc.? And then we will get on to this later, actually, about this and how Farrell actually makes a good case about this. And is this not capable of being understood in a Docetist sense? In this regard, one must recall that Severus speaks of operational energy as the eruption of the will. Thus, one arrives at the classical Monophysite formula of one energy, one will, which has two sets of manifestations. This is crucial because a lot of people make this mistake. We will get to this more in depth, but a lot of people will see like Diotelite statements from Severus, and they will think that, oh, that means he believes in two wills. Well, not actually, because in all of those statements, he talks about it being displayed as two wills. So, for example, a statement I've heard Severus says is that in the crucifixion, Christ displays two wills in salvific suffering. And a lot of people use that to say, oh, look, we are Diotelites. Well, actually, he says displays. That's the key word. He displays. There's two manifestations of the one divine human theandric will. And again, we will get to this very much in detail, how this exactly happens, which we'll actually get to now exactly. If you have anything to add, we'll get to Severus's theology and how the Oriental theology leads to monoenergism and monothelitism.
Yeah, this is the
and
key.
How the
this is the
controversy even began.
Right. This is the key thing to understand, that the track of this debate goes in a certain way. So it's really difficult to try to dive into this issue and try to understand it or discuss it if you don't have the right entrance point, right? If you don't have the right place to come into the debate. If you come into the debate at the time of Chalcedon, you won't know that this moves into the subject of two energies and two wills. And this is why St. Maximus will be so crucial, because Maximus will have a dispute with Pyrrhus that I've talked about many times. And we're actually going to do a whole talk on this book, as I promised a long time ago. I just forgot about it. And what we're going to see is that there's a dialectic at work in the tension between, there's an assumed natural tension on the part of people like Severus between the human will and the divine will, whether in man or in Christ. It's just assumed that there's going to be some natural tension. You actually see that natural tension in Augustine as well. So I want to stress to everybody, the place to start on this topic, it is relevant if you do want to get into these topics. If you just dive in at Chalcedon, it's going to be difficult. It's going to be confusing. So, of course, as we have recommended for many years, one of the great places to start is the dispute with Nestorius, St. Cyril of Alexandria, and the Christological Controversy, the John McGuckin book. And then we have, I would recommend especially the Bradshaw book, because the latter chapters of the Bradshaw book are actually going to show the Augustinian underlying assumptions of simplicity that will not only underlie the Western Latin tradition of the Triad and their errors on the Trinity and the Filioque, but it's actually going to explain the Western notion of form and essence and simplicity. Okay, and this conditions the Christology. This is so important to understand, is that the essence energy issue is not just about the Triad. It's crucially about Christology, and this comes to the forefront of the debate at the Sixth Council. So when St. Maximus argues this against Pyrrhus, the Monothelite, who is the outworking of this Miaphysite Oriental sense of the term, right? Because we can understand Miaphysis in an Orthodox way. By the time that it's being debated in Maximus's day, St. Maximus's day, the debate becomes about the natural tension between the human will and energy and the divine. And so the debate, a lot of it will be about, in this book, Christ saying, "Let this cup pass from me." And this will lead eventually to the denial of the gnomic will. So Christ not possessing a gnomic will necessitates that he's a, strictly speaking, divine hypostasis who possesses a divine and human nature. Right? There's no created hypostasis in Christ, because if you possessed a created hypostasis, then most likely there would be some notion of a gnomic will. But the argument is often made that he doesn't possess a gnomic will because he's a divine person. So the Neo-Kyrillic defense is what wins out after the Chalcedonian debates. So there's 2-3 centuries afterwards of debate after Chalcedon as to what these terms and these words mean. And again, the solution to all of this, in my view, all this stuff with the debates with the Orientals, is just simply understanding the consistent patterns of how we understand those words. It's beginning to be crystallized in the times of Athanasius and into the Cappadocians. I'm not saying that it wasn't true before that. It's just beginning to be crystallized as to what hypostasis means, as to what inhypostatize means. It's particularly Leontius of Jerusalem, who really codifies in the Cyrillian sense the notion of what inhypostatize means. And that's why this comes to dominate after that period, right? After the time of Leontius into the Sixth Council, the Confession of St. Sophronius is all saying what we say, right? So that's how we get to this notion that Christ possesses two wills, two energies, because energy is, as St. John of Damascus, all the way back to the Cappadocians, energy signifies the type of nature. If Christ possesses a human and a divine nature, then he has to always possess two wills and two energies, even though they're not in tension. They're always in symphonia. They're working together in Christ. That's the Orthodox view. So the human will is deified by the divine will and energy, as the Fifth and Sixth Council specify, as Exposition of Orthodox Faith Book 3 specifies. Christ communicates to his humanity the divine glories of the uncreated energies. That means it raises and deifies his human nature, but it doesn't lose its natural properties. So there's always a human created aspect to Christ, even though it's deified. It's never destroyed, it's never divided, it's never absolved. It always retains its natural properties, even though it's deified. So when Jesus is resurrected, it's the same body that he had before he was resurrected, but it's deified. So in the same way, this is the model, not just for Christology, it's the model for the essence-energy distinction, how God relates to and interacts with the world. It's the basis for Maximus's logos-logi doctrine, right? Because the logi interpenetrate all reality. They are the bases of all created reality, being the patterns and ideas and archetypes in the divine mind, in the logos. That's why all things are made through the logos. Again, the logi are uncreated energies. And the same thing is going to be applied here in Christology in the debate between the wills and the natures, right? There's a balance here. There's a synergy here. And everything that David's telling you comes to the forefront in this dispute with Pyrrhus. All the stuff that I just said about the logi, the uncreated energy, that's all in this debate right here. That's the whole locus of this debate. This is what's cited at the Sixth Council. When Pope St. Agatha writes his letter about Christ possessing two wills and two energies, when St. Sophronius writes his letter about Christ possessing two wills and two energies, this book here is the source for this. So what David is going to tell you right now is crucial to the solution of this whole issue.
Yep, because what I'm going to be talking about now is John of Ephesus, who is also, to my knowledge, also part of the anti-Chalcedonian team. He says that Severus, Philoxenus, these people were really the creators of the Monothelite movement. So an objection that we hear generally is that, oh, Pyrrhus was a Chalcedonian. He's your problem. That's like a Muslim saying, like, Arianism is your problem. I mean, it doesn't really make any sense. It's a problem for us because monothelitism is wrong. But in their theology, many of their fathers actually teach that. But again, I can feel for the anti-Chalcedonians in the sense of, well, how, like, can you demonstrate how it is monothelite, how it is monoenergists?
Right.
Actually, precisely, that's what we're going to be doing right now. So I want to start with a quote from Severus in his homily 125. He says that hypostasis does not deny genus or ousia or abolish it, but it sets apart and limits in particular icons the one who subsists. Now, what does this really mean? If you're talking about Severus's system, and I also talked about this in the first stream, he believes that reality exists in three planes. So there's a Trinitarian realm, there is the intelligible realm, the realm of the angels, right? And then there's a material world that we inhabit in right now. So it's key to understand that for him, the unity of the hypostasis of Christ is not like two material substances that are mixed, right? They each operate in their own reality. They're in synthesis, which is what we will also say. It is a synthesis. St. Kirill himself says that the union is a synthesis. So in that point, we agree with Severus that there is a synthesis. But because of his system, which is based on Plato, based on Platonism, and he's trying to basically Christianize that system, I will say he's attempting to at least Christianize the system, unlike trying to Hellenizing it. But the problem is that in his system, these two natures, these two hypostases, they operate in their own realms. So the wills operate in their own reality. So the divine will, the way it operates in the Trinitarian realm. The problem here is that Severus himself says, I believe in homily, which one exact? 81, I believe, homily 81, where he talks about that the human will is an iconic representation of the divine will, just as the body is the iconic representation of the soul. So there's a synonymity here, right? Just like how the soul animates the body, so does the divine will animate the human will. And this is precisely what we mean by monothelitism in Severus. It is the divine will that animates the human will and gives it life. It's because the human will is non-self-subsistent, it needs the divine will in order to exist. Just like how the human hypostasis is non-self-subsistent, it requires the divine hypostasis in order to exist. So this applies to energies, and it also applies to the wills. And if you're not convinced, you might say, that seems like a different argument. Well, let's hear from Severus himself. This is from text 26, his letter to John the Higumenos. He says that, and he quotes from Saint Dionysius the Areopagite, which, again, to be fair to Severus, he is quoting these people, and he considers Saint Dionysius as an authentic apostle. So to his credit, he tries to be patristic, and he tries to be logical with the Cappadocians. But here's what he says. He says that, as we have already written, this is to John the Higumenos, text 26 of the Severus of Antioch book from Paul and Allen. As we have already written extensively in other writings, we have understood and understand the statement of the all-holy Dionysius the Areopagite, who says, when God became human, he performed for us a new divine human theandric activity, as meaning one composite activity. But this is what he says that we will disagree with heavily. So far it's good, but then he says, in our eyes, it cannot be understood other than as a rejection of every duality. So here he is very obviously saying that we don't accept the duality of wills. And there's also numerous quotations that we have that we will get to where he believes that separates the will. So this obviously strongly implies that Severus rejects diotheletism, and this is his basis, right? The Tome of Leo was actually very crucial in the Sixth Ecumenical Council because precisely it spoke of two forms operating and two wills and two energies operating. And this is actually this is the main part that he disagrees. So he disagrees with the Tome of Leo, not because of the two forms, but because the two forms have their own energies, have their own operations and their own will. So this is from Against Julian. This is text 13 in the Paul and Allen book. When he's responding to Julian of Halicarnassus, who says that Christ has a non-different difference, right? He says, so Julian accuses Severus of believing in two properties, right? He said, you believe in two properties, you believe in two natures, you believe in two operations and all that stuff. You're like the Chalcedonians. And Severus responds, in reply to these things, we shall say in short one simple true word, show us that we have written somewhere that Christ exists in two natures and in two properties. But you cannot say so. For in every place each person discovers that our loveliness anathematizes those who divide the one Christ in the duplication of natures and of their operations and their properties. Right? So notice how he talks about dividing the Christ in two operations, in a duplication of operations of the natures. And this statement is very crucial because he also implies, again, in a duplication of natures, remember, for him nature is hypostasis.
Right.
In a duplication of natures and of their operations and their properties. Now, what's the problem? So for him, hypostasis is where energy and will resides. But there's a very simple objection to that, and we talked about it numerous times. If energy was proper to hypostasis,
then there would be three wills and three energies in the Trinity. Right.
Tritheism, right? Exactly. So again, this theology, in another sense, we can see that this theology kind of leads to.
So I mean, typically the Orientals, to reply to that, I mean, they just have to divide. They have to reject that predicating back right into the triad. That there's a similarity between nature, person, and will in the triad, and the way that nature, person, and will function in anthropology and Christology, right?
Yep. I missed that kind of. I'm sorry. This is going to be weird, but I missed that. Can you repeat that again? I missed that.
Do they? So you've interacted with a lot of those guys one-on-one more than I have, and I'm asking a question in terms. I've read the theology that we're talking about, but I'm not interacting with a lot of these guys in terms of like debates and discussions. What I'm asking is that do they? I mean, it seems to me that they would have to deny that there is a reading back or reflexive predication between the triad and Christology. In other words, wouldn't they just have to say, well, In the triad, it's not that way. We have one will in God, one energy, three hypostases, but in terms of the incarnation, it's not that way. It's different.
Yeah, usually when I or like my friends who got these arguments from me, like when they make these arguments against Orientals, they literally do not give an answer, which is very strange. So one instance that was pretty funny is that a friend of mine were talking about, like, why do you reject duality in Christ? And the Oriental, he replied with, well, duality presupposes separation, right? Because there's a distinction here. And then my friend obviously went on to say, well, but the persons in the Trinity are distinct. Does that mean the Trinity is divided? No, actually, Severus says yes, in the sense of hypostasis, but he literally got no answers from that. So yeah, there is like different applications of Christology and Trinitarian theology. It's kind of like double theology in that sense. And so far, I haven't really gotten any responses, because usually, again, most of these people, they will adamantly like try to make their position the same as ours, right? They will try to adamantly be diotelite, even though, as you can see, their fathers reject diotelitism. I mean, he says there is no duality in Christ's theandric will, right? So the synthetic will is one. So I haven't really heard any proper responses, and you're going to have a hard time hearing a proper response usually, because either they don't know of these things, this is pretty like high level, or actually that's pretty much most of the reason, or they just want to pretend to be like us. So these are the main problems that occur in these debates. I'll continue on with some of the quotations of Severus. This is Severus letter 47. He says, considering the general benefit of a union of the holy churches and demanding an open anathema of the things done at Chalcedon against the Orthodox faith, and of the wicked tome of Leo, and of those who speak of two natures after the union, and the operations of these and their properties, right? So again, obviously he's not referring to two natures after the union as to mean essence, right? If he meant that, then that will be even worse, because then he will be Eutychian. But he means nature to be hypostasis here, and operations of the hypostasis of these and their properties. There's another example, letter 39. I'm not going to read the entire thing. Actually, I will. So also a man who accepts the right confession of the edict, if it is enough for him and he does not add the exact words which remove the heresy, opens a door to impiety through the ambiguity of the written words, and falls under the sentences of the Holy Gregory in that he is doing detriment to the truth. But if besides the edict he both confesses one incarnate nature of God the Word, and anathematizes those who speak of two natures after the union, and the operations and properties of these, and all the impiety that was confirmed at Calcutta, he has removed the danger that is expected from the ambiguity. So this is letter 39. This is the final letter that I will read. This is his letter to Ecumenicus, so letter 1. Accordingly, good doctrine is contained in of the Syrian king, for it anathematizes those who divide the one Son, who was hypostatically united to flesh, into two natures, and the operations and properties of the same two natures. So again, this is the main difference that they have with the Tome of Leo. It's not really about nature per se, it's about the energies, wills, and all that jazz. That's really the real difference here.
Human will becomes an iconic representation of the divine will and is subjected to it. There's a dialectical definition of will and choice here. This is a critique that Farrell makes in the section on energy, will, and agency. And the point there is to say, once again, that this whole position is predicated on dialectics, that there has to be some natural tension between created and uncreated, between human will and divine will, between grace and nature.
And we will talk exactly about that. So that's enough about Severus for now. I will introduce Philoxenus of Mabog into this. So he was a bishop of modern-day Manbij. He was a contemporary of Severus of Antioch, and he's a huge deal. So if the West has St. Augustine, St. Jerome, and Thomas Aquinas as their faces, then Orientals, at least in their mind, their faces will be St. Cyril of Alexandria, Severus of Antioch, and Philoxenus of Mabog. They will be like the faces of Oriental theology. The thing about Philoxenus of Mabog is his theology is even more explicitly heretical. So if you look at page 68 and 69 in the book Three Monophysite Christologies, Severus of Antioch, Philoxenus of Mabog, and Jacob of Sarug, this book was written by Roberta Chestnut. Page 68 and 69, Philoxenus believes in materialism. So he preaches materialism. He believes that the body is the densest, the soul is lighter, and God is the lightest being of all. So he believes in some form of materialism. Having made that note, what he says in homily 12, he believes that the body and the soul have two wills at war with each other. So this is the body soul, right? Human body and soul. So the body has a will and the soul has a will. And this raises an obvious question, right? How is it that we have one will as human beings then, if body and the soul has a will and they are in war with each other? Well, it's dialectics of opposition. The wills are in a synthetic union where they battle over each other. And if the body wins, right, if the bodily will wins, it's adultery. If the soul wins, it's a good union. And this is in homily 12 of Philoxenus of Mabog. He also goes on to say that the bodily will doesn't merely lust after food or sexual satisfaction or any of that. This is not what the bodily will is. It's literally about everything about the world. So philosophy, science, rationality, argumentation, debates, these are all lusts of the body. They're all part of the body will. And the soul lusts after the things of the spirit, right? So for the spiritual realm, this is what so it's like the soul is like this hyper pietistic, and the body is this like I will always debate it, like this crazy debate maniac guy. If we were personifying these two body soul wills, and these two, as Philoxenus himself says, I have the screenshot, Jay, if you're showing that in homily 10, 11, and 12, he consistently says that the body and the soul are by nature opposed to each other. So by nature, they're opposed to each other, according to Philoxenus of Mabog. So this is how humanity is formed. And again, why are we talking about body and soul? Well, it deals with anthropology, but it also deals with Christ himself, right? This also applies to Christ himself and his body and his soul. Now, some people might say, oh, this is too far. We reject that. Okay, they'll say this is too far. We don't agree with everything Philoxenus says. Well, that's a problem because Severus and Philoxenus were good friends. They knew each other. They knew what they believed. They knew each other. So we will say Philoxenus doesn't have a different Christology. He complements, I will say, Severus's Christology because, as I said, they're both in the same team. They both very well know each other. But to repeat on the human will, on how the human will is formed. Again, the human will is synthetically formed, just like how the divine and human will are synthetically formed. We call this the theandric will. And these are in opposition with each other. And just like that, the divine will and the human will are also by nature in opposition to one another. There's an example of Severus of Antioch where he speaks of again, Christ displaying two wills in salvific suffering. He then goes on to say that Christ in his humanity was very fearful, and Philoxenus and Severus both agree that he was more fearful than a normal human will, right? He was incredibly fearful, but at the same time, he had divine courage. And what St. Maximus will say in response to this is that fear and courage are both human emotions, right? So these both pertain to the human will of Christ. They're not in dialectical tension, right? The human will wasn't scared, and the divine will was saying, oh, whatever, it's fine. There wasn't any tension like that between those two. But in their view, in the Oriental view, there is a tension. And what's really important, again, this will is synthetic, just like how Christ's will is synthetic. A huge implication, and we can see from Severus himself, and most likely Philoxenus, they both reject apocatastasis, and that's obviously because they want to follow the fathers, right? So we can credit them for that. They're trying to remain orthodox, but the problem is in their theology, if the divine will in Christ animated the human will, then how is it that in the recapitulation, how is it that Christ is not going to animate our human wills again? How is it that, because in Christ, the human will was subsumed and was dominated by the divine will. then that logically follows the same should be happening in the eschaton. Therefore, universalism should actually be true. Isn't that true? Shouldn't, in the Oriental view, universalism be the consistent theological truth instead of the whatever version of apokatastasis they have? So someone, Stephen Barsud-Hiley, even takes this one step further, and he says that, and he's a heretic according to the Oriental position, but his view is very interesting because I think it's logically consistent. He says that not only will we all be saved, but we will all be consubstantial with God himself. So again, this position is heretical in the Oriental Church, so this is not an attack against Oriental Church, but I'm just saying that this is what logically should follow if you have this doctrine of wills. This is what should be happening, because if in Christ the divine will dominates the human will, then who is to say the same won't be happening to us? That's why we have a synergy of the human and divine wills. We don't have an opposition, because the moment you have an opposition, there are many different theological problems that come out of that. So that's Wold. And if you look at Jacob of Saruk, just a small chapter on him, on wills, he himself, like, he absolutely believes that there's one nature, one will, one energy. Like, he's very open about that. And he's a saint in the church. He's an important saint, not theologically speaking, but as a general saint, he's very important in their communion. So do you have anything to add about wills, Jay? Because that will be
just that it's important to understand that the movement and action and property of will can't be defined after the fall. A post-lapsarian doctrine of a defining free will is part of what affects the Western Augustinian definition. So you don't have in Augustine, for example, any notion of the ability to choose between multiple goods. And this actually comes into the debate with the Monothelites in terms of Pyrrhus. And the way that St. Maximus will debate with Pyrrhus, he'll actually make the argument that if there's only one essence that we are directing our gaze towards, then the Origenistic definition of free will being defined as a choice between good and evil is by necessity married to the notion of turning the gaze away from the one, the essence of the one. This is another reason why we can't hold to the beatific vision. So this is absolutely connected to what we're talking about in terms of Christology, because in the eschaton, we're not just staring into the beatific vision of the essence of God. That's why the Eastern Fathers nowhere teach this. They teach that we see, as St. Maximus says, the many things around God in the eschaton. The vision of God in the eschaton is the vision of the uncreated logoi. And so that's a direct experience of God, but it's also the ability to retain free will. How do we retain free will if there's no evil? Because free will is not defined dialectically between a choice of good and evil. That's only characteristic of the fallen state. When we're not in the fallen state anymore, there's the ability to choose and to move the will as a choice between multiple goods. And so all of the church fathers will define free will as the ability to make choices, this thing or that thing. But if there's only the essence of God, then you can't potentially or possibly actually choose or will anything other than the essence of God. This is very crucial because absolute divine simplicity is not just a doctrine of denying the essence-energy distinction. It also applies to Christology. It makes Christology impossible. It leads to the dialectical tension in people like Severus and the way that they define simplicity. Severus will actually use the Neoplatonic definition of what simplicity is when he talks about what these natures are in themselves. And so he makes them reducible into one-dimensional categories in terms of what nature is or is supposed to be, especially in the incarnation. And so this has an effect on one's doctrine of free will and choice. And so in the eschaton, all those positions that believe in the beatific vision in the Roman Catholic Latin sense, they all deny free will in the eschaton. They'll redefine it to say, well, your will is truly free now because you don't make choices. You only choose the essence of God. But that's a complete rejection and denial of what all the church fathers taught free will was. Did Christ possess free will when he was incarnate? Of course he did. Did he only will one thing? Did he only will the essence of God? I mean, that's ridiculous, right? No. Christ, just as God can freely will to do different things. God freely chose to create the world. Christ freely walked around and willed to do what he did. And he freely willed in both of his natures, right? The human will and the divine will were freely moving and operating.
Sorry, I interrupted you, Jay.
No,
but I was gonna add the Oriental response to this. The Oriental view will be that since God is good, like he's merely good, then there is no kind of like there is free will, but because God is good, the free will aspect is only in the human will, if that makes sense. In contrast to like how they will view this will's question.
Go ahead.
All right, I'll go ahead, I guess. In this, I think I dealt with wills. I want to kind of talk about, to move on, I want to move on to Philoxenus's Eucharistic problems. I mentioned this in the first stream as well with Jay. So there are two. So Christ for Philoxenus exists as God by nature and as a man by miracle. So there's like two different modes of existences. There's a miraculous existence that he exists by the virtue of his will, and his natural existence as God. Now, this is relevant because this goes into the Eucharistic theology. And so as an example I used is, let's say that you're an atheist and you're an anti-Calcutta church, and Philoxenus is right there like looking at you, and you take the Eucharist. You're atheist, you don't believe in anything, but you somehow manage to take the Eucharist, and you come back to Philoxenus and you're like, hey, I took the Eucharist and you said that you guys say that I was going to get damned, but nothing happened to me. And Philoxenus will respond to that, well, yes, because you don't have faith. You don't have faith. So the way you observe the Eucharist, that's just mere bread and wine. But if you had faith, right, the mode which the Eucharist will exist via those who have faith is that it will really be the body and blood of Christ. Now, this, in a sense, makes some sense, but the problem is that if you apply this to Christ, then there are some problems, right? For example, if you don't have faith, then is Christ God? And this kind of enables a question to be asked to Philoxenus and leads to certain rabbit holes that Philoxenus himself will reject. But his understanding of being by nature and being by faith, and this kind of two levels, two modes of being, enables problematic conclusions. So the argument I'm making here is that if the Eucharist changes depending on how you view the Eucharist, then naturally, by that logic, Christ should be changing depending on how you view Christ, right? So if you look at the Eucharist without faith, obviously, Philoxenus will say, well, obviously that's bread and wine. But if you have faith, that will be the body and blood of Christ. So if Christ was in front of us, will he be a mere human being if I didn't have faith? Well, this leads to some kind of like a relativistic understanding of reality. And to finalize, this is kind of like the end, but I would like to talk about Jacob of Sarug, who's, by the way, as a small aside, he is in the 2004 Roman Martyrology, so he's a saint in the Latin Rite as well. So good job, Roman Catholics. And he's an anti-Chalcedonian, right? He wasn't in communion with the Orthodox Church. So there's some really problematic things that Jacob says. I'm going to list some of them. In Homily 53, he says that the disciples asked Jesus, he's talking about Judas, right? The disciples asked Jesus, who has gone out of the sphere of the light of our Lord to go and mix with the darkness in a great movement. So there are multiple senses in mixture is used. And in most of the time, if you're talking about Philoxenus and Severus, when they speak of a mixture, they don't mean it in a heterodox sense, right? They don't really mean it in a heterodox sense. They're limited by their own terminology. But Jacob, in that sense, when he's speaking of Judas's essence mixing with the darkness, he is first of all saying that evil has a real existence, that it's not a mere privation, but it actually exists. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, Judas's essence mixed with evil, and this is actually a Gnostic idea.
Yeah, this is Manichaean
that Jacob uses. And as a matter of fact, like, I'm not going to talk about every single Gnosticizing thing that Jacob says, but if you read the book, Roberto Chestnut's Three Monophysite Christologies, Severus of Antioch, Philoxenus of Mabog, Jacob of Sarug, if you read the section about Jacob of Sarug, there's many different things that are Gnosticizing. Does that mean that he is Gnostic? I don't think he is by intention, but the stuff that he says has a lot of Gnostic messagery. So he refers to the Mother of God, to Mary, as as some sort of an envelope. Like he's some sort of like a sacred secret envelope that that is hidden from people. And these small minor Gnostic teams, again, so I won't say that he's Gnostic theologically speaking, but there's another thing that he
Wait,
says
you
that
won't
is,
say
I
who?
think,
You
very
won't say
interesting.
Severus or Jacob?
Jacob.
Okay.
I don't think Jacob is intentionally being Gnostic, but a lot of the teams that he talks about is definitely like
I think in
teams taken
Severus
from
there
Gnostic.
is. I mean, the crazy part about Severus that struck me was the discussions about the unknowability of the Father, and that you have to have this sort of ascent through
Yeah.
Christ, and then this is the Neoplatonic doctrine of ascent, actually, of emanation and
In the,
return.
yeah, in letter 65, he actually talks about how the Son is, I believe this was cited in the Chestnut book as well. In letter 65, Severus talks about how Christ is the object of the contemplation of the Father. So there's some aspect of logos theology here, like
Right.
old logos theology. But it's also the same thing that Arians said, right? I mean, and a lot of Gnostics said to justify the createdness of Christ. So again, yeah, that team also exists in Severus, and again, it's in letter 65, where it's a long letter where he deals with multiple questions. Some of them are triological questions. Some of them are dealing with theopaskism. Some of them are dealing with other theological stuff. But I believe in the first part he kind of talks about that. That Christ is the object of the contemplation of the. Don't the Roman Catholics say the same thing? Or am I wrong on that?
How did you phrase it? Say it again.
Um, the Chestnut book speaks of Christ being the object of the contemplation of the Father. So he is the object of Father's contemplation.
Sometimes,
Let me
yeah.
find it.
That's in some of the Logos apologists speak this way. I think Tertullian speaks that way. Some of that could be in the Cappadocians, off the top of my head. But yeah, I'd have to look at the actual text, but it depends. So maybe not that terminology itself, because you could find some of that in the early apologists will make usage of that, but then they sort of make a lot of mistakes. People like Tatian and people like that. So we have to be really careful there. Have to see the way that they do appropriate the psychological analogy of mind and will. The Father, mind, will, breath. This kind of stuff is pretty common even in the Eastern Fathers. But the problem is that they still couch it within the context of Orthodox theology and Christology, whereas in Roman Catholicism, or in what we're seeing here, because you get an oftentimes a smushing of nature into person, of properties into essence, of energy into essence, that's where it starts to become problematic, because now we're confusing the energies of the Godhead with the persons, right? So the Spirit is the love of God in a strict identity. You see, the Logos is quite literally the reason of the Father, and not the manifestation of the reason of the Godhead. Because reason, if we're talking about the divine mind here, okay, mind is a property of nature, so all three hypostases possess the divine mind. So the Son, in a unique mode, he manifests in his unique mode the mind of God, as does the Spirit and as does the Father. But we wouldn't identify the Logos with the mind of God in a strict identification. Does that make sense? So you see the same problem here. It's just, once again, in a lot of these errors and heresies, whether it's Roman Catholicism or whether it's these guys, the mistake is to reduce essences or natures or beings or persons to their properties or to their faculties.
All right. And the final thing that I was going to add is about another concept that Jacob speaks. This is very interesting because he says, I believe it's in Homily 125, he says, before the created things, the Father sealed the image of his Son and formed him and showed how he will shine among the earthly beings. The Father looked at the image of his Son and formed Adam. Because of this, he said, let us make man in our image, in this image of the child of Mary, the only begotten. So we will say that we are made in the image of God, but Jacob, actually in Homily 125, is saying that we're made in the image of Christ. We're particularly made in the image of the incarnate Christ. So God sees the future, sees Christ in the future, and forms our image based on him. And I would say this is interesting, but it also denies that we're made in the image of the triune God. So this has huge problem in the theology of Jacob. And I will say all of this stuff, it will be pretty hard for me to recap, but all of this stuff is pretty much what I had to talk about today, unless you have something else to add and something else that you want me to talk about, which we can, or we can go to the super chats. What do you say, Jay?
Yeah, I want to remind everybody that if you want more on this, you can subscribe to David's channel. He has a really extensive analysis in his most recent 3-part series of these issues. I would again stress that. So if you do have God, History, Dialectic, Volume 1, this discussion of what we're talking about takes place on about page 225, roughly up to the end of the book, where he talks about these faculties and these energies and these wills being in opposition. But that is a pretty advanced approach. If you're new to this topic, I want to stress that the place to begin the Christological debates, I wouldn't even say jump to Pope St. Leo's tome. It helps to have this in your mind. This is the best introduction to the issues and the debates with Nestorius, because Arianism and Nestorianism kick off the problems that David is talking about, right? Because it's St. Cyril who will use the mia fistis formula, which we would read in an Orthodox way, to mean not a denial of the retaining of the two properties, of the two natures. I would also recommend, after the Cyril book, or you could start with this one, please read the Bradshaw book if you really want to get into these topics. And read the whole book. Don't read the first half of it just about Aristotle, because he will get up into the conclusions of these issues all the way into Augustine and into Aquinas, and the contrasting of Palamas and Aquinas, and the contrasting of St. Maximus in terms of the logos and the logi, and how that's not the same thing as what you get in the Latin tradition. Bradshaw, one of the authorities on these topics, right? Everything you've ever heard me say is really just echoing what Bradshaw has said. And Bradshaw is going to vindicate all the stuff that David just said. Now, he's not talking about the Oriental issues, but what I'm trying to tell you is that the philosophical assumptions that underlie the debate of all the Orientals and the Monophysite, blah, 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 all that stuff, up into the Monothelites and the Monoenergists, is the same philosophical assumptions that this book is about, all the way up into Severus. So these are crucial texts. They're very key. And if you read these texts and you understand them, I highly recommend it. Please read the David Bradshaw book. The Farrell book is great, but it's a little more advanced, right? And if you don't want to go into that, just read the Dispute with Purists. You'll see all the stuff that you've heard me say for all these years, all this stuff I constantly repeat. I mean, it's all right here. I'm not making this stuff up. I mean, David, let me ask you a question. So a year ago, when you and I started interacting a lot on my Discord, and we were having a lot of these discussions, I'm not just trying to tout myself, but I wanted to get your account of this. Now that you have you've jumped into this issue for the last year, would you say that you see the symphony of the topics that I originally was arguing with you? Not that you were disagreeing, but trying to explain to you a year ago. Does it not seem to cohere? Do the issues not make sense? Does it not make sense now?
Obviously it does. I mean, one of the first, I could give you an example. When it came to the essence energies distinction, a mistake I made, for example, is that I looked at like the issue itself. I try to mine essence energies distinction in the fathers. But once you read the fathers, for example, the principle you talk a lot about, distinction not meaning composition or division, I see it in in Christology regularly, right? As opposed to the things you talk about, or the things that the Orthodox Church Fathers talk about. I don't see that, for example, in Thomism. I don't see any Thomism in the Church Fathers. I do see a lot of the stuff that you told me you were talking about in the Church Fathers.
There's a whole section in here about how the logi are not the same thing as Augustine's exemplars. And Augustine's exemplar doctrine passes directly into Thomas Aquinas. Yes, Thomas Aquinas has differences with Augustine on the doctrine of illumination. They have two different notions of divine illumination. But it doesn't really matter, because the doctrine of simplicity is exactly the same. And so therefore, the exemplar doctrine of the Latin Church is not the same thing as the logi doctrine. And so therefore, natural theology in the Thomistic sense is not and cannot be the Orthodox position.
exactly. And what I was gonna add.
But I wanted to thank you, David. So let's now that you've dived into these issues, would you agree? Where would you start if you wanted to really research the topic? Like, what have you found to be the most kind of beneficial, advantageous works?
In regards to Oriental, anti-Chalcedonian theology.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, in terms of disputing, in terms of disputes, obviously start with the Father McGuckin book. That's what I started with. After reading that, I think I read God History Dialectic to get more scope, but it's kind of unrelated. A lot of the arguments that I got is from God History Dialectic. But I will say it depends on what you're worried about. So, for example, if you're worried about specific points, like in my case, when I start to understand Orthodox theology a lot more, what I did, for example, is that I looked into certain characters, like Theodoret of Cyrus, for example. I read Eranistes by Theodoret of Cyrus, and that really helped me a lot because I saw the things that St. Kirill said in him, and it really helped me a lot. If you want diaphysitism in the Church Fathers and this Cyrillic Chalcedonian argumentation, I will recommend you to check out Leontius of Jerusalem's Against the Monophysites. I did a book review of that in part 3 of the video series. If you want to understand Severan theology, like what Severus himself says, I think you can go to first-hand sources if you understand the terminology. So the best book you can get is the Roberta Chestnut book, The Three Monophysite Christologies. You can get Severus of Antioch, book on Severus of Antioch by Pauline Allen if you want to read him directly. If you want to read about the Council of Chalcedon, I will have said the defense of the Chalcedon, the defense of the Council of Chalcedon in the East by Patrick Gray will be great. The problem is there's only like 3 books available online, and the cheapest one is like $77, so I don't think that's possible. That's why I'm probably going to try to do a book review of that sometime. But if you want to read about the Council of Chalcedon, you can read the Acts of the Council of Chalcedon. There's also, I didn't read it yet, but I think the Byzantine Christ by Demetrius Batrelos is also relevant to this. Basically, if you look at my announcement stream, I cite all of the books that I read and I will be using in the future videos I will be making, which I made like all of them basically right now, including this one. Those books are what you should be looking for, I think, and it's very important to understand these Cyrillic Chalcedonian theology and theological points, because it will actually change the debate for you. For me, the first time I heard the arguments, I thought they meant nature is ousia, and that's what I was kind of complacent. I was like, it's so silly that they will believe that Christ is only divine, haha. And then understanding these things, understanding this debate, helped me really get the debate. And that's the best thing you can do, because many people, except for me and Jay, I think, like, they won't really be helpful in this regard. There, you will either hear like arguments that are straw men, that don't represent the Oriental position well, or you will hear arguments saying, "Oh, we actually believe in the same thing." So basically, 2 groups of people that don't really understand what's going on will say all of this stuff. And so the books that I mentioned in part 0, ultimately, you should read all of them, I think. But if you want, if you're like if you don't have any knowledge, the St. Kirill Alexandria book by Father John McGuckin is great. And then I will say, for me, I mean, the God History Dialectic book was really, it wasn't as advanced as I think it will be. I kind of understood a lot of the stuff, but maybe that's because I kind of expected some of the stuff to be said there already. But I think that will also, like, because if you don't understand general Christology, you're going to have a very hard time really getting some of the arguments that many of our saints make.
Now, let's say
the Answer of Jerusalem book will be great. Yeah,
I would say if you want a introduction to the bigger picture here, and I'm thinking about doing a lecture just on this, because I found my old notes. I took about 100 pages of notes 10 years ago on multiple works that relate to this topic. So I actually have a whole folder here that's just nothing but my 100 pages of notes that I took on the Pelican series. The Pelican series is great, so it covers. We're mainly only concerned with like the first 1,000 years and then and into the Middle Ages. So we're not really concerned with modern Protestantism and modern theology. The last two in this, it's a 5-volume series, but the first 3 of the Pelican set are really good. So I think in the near future we will also do an analysis from my 100 pages of notes I took, and then if somebody wants another, let's see, I had another introductory, another introductory book to these topics is also Pelican's Christianity and Classical Culture, right? And so, yes, he will talk a lot about natural law. He will talk a lot about the principles of nature, as does St. Maximus. But does that mean the same thing as Thomism? Right. So no, it's not word concept fallacy. So if you want maybe a broader perspective to start with these topics, these are the books that I would recommend. And then, of course, don't forget the St. Justinian himself has a great work on the person of Christ. So
yes, that's actually a good point.
Yeah. So those are all are all good. And then let's look at some of the super chats that we have here. I got stacks of books falling over here. All right, let's see. We've got a few here. Robert Taylor, $5. Not the previous Robert Taylor, the different Robert Taylor. I read the Hoffman's Cult Renaissance Church of Rome, and he complements Orthodox ecclesiology and iconography. Yeah, well, this is the ecclesiology and iconography of the first millennium is what you see in the Seventh Ecumenical Council. So actually, if you read the Synodicon of Orthodoxy, it's a great refutation of seeing how the Roman Catholic Church canonically departed from what we have in the Seventh Synod. And again, somebody should find out if Uniates affirm the Synodicon, because that would be a great argument if anybody can find this out. If Uniates do affirm the Synodicon of Orthodoxy from the Seventh Synod, then yeah, that's just one of many Roman Catholic contradictions. But yes, I do think Occult Renaissance Church of Rome showed me a lot of things that I missed about the Renaissance. So it's a really good analysis of the second millennium. His severe lack, of course, is not knowing about the first millennium, as is unfortunately the case with many Roman Catholics. So he says, Blessed Lent, and Heath is citing the book saying Rome defected in the 13th century. Yeah, I mean, you could have different arguments as to exactly where to pinpoint the date, because it's more of a long flowering of a movement all the way back to the time of Augustine. Again, I'm tired of debating this issue, so read the Bradshaw book. The chapter on Augustine is really good. It just really solidifies it in a really clear way in a brief chapter. So we shouldn't have to keep debating these topics. It's pretty easy to understand if you read these works. So there's a development. It's not necessarily, we're not saying Augustine is evil. He made some mistakes, as did St. Gregory of Nyssa, other people. St. Maximus corrects mistakes and errors that St. Gregory of Nyssa made. So there's nothing wrong with this. We don't follow one dude. We follow the consensus patrum, right? The consensus of the fathers. So I would say go easy. Don't rush into these topics. Take your time. It'll become evident. And yes, there is a good historical critique of the Renaissance in that book. Franklin Chan, 1999. Thank you for all your work, Jay, and thank you for your great guest. Well, yes, David has done a tremendous amount of work. He has learned at a lightning speed the last year on these topics. So definitely subscribe to David's channel down there, and you will get some based, solid Christology there. And hopefully we can I think David is trying to get a debate going, right? Are you trying to get a debate with somebody?
Yes, I just got a debate with a person on Twitter. Severin Zealots will be debating on Bright Saturday, on Bright Week. I decided to debate him because he represents the position very well, and I think he knows his stuff, unlike many of the people. In my part 2, I said I declared a debate to Farrington. But on Facebook, he said stupid stuff like, "Oh, I studied this stuff for 30 years, and we believe in the same thing, so I'm not taking him seriously if he's gonna say stuff like that." But yeah, I'll have a debate in 2 months about this exact issue. So tune in for that. It's gonna be great.
All right, ML says for $10. Thank you, by the way, Franklin, for that. I much appreciated. ML says for $10, in the disputation with Pyrrhus, I think it's paragraph 184, Maximus claims that the distinctions in Christ are effectively virtual. I don't have the book in front of me, but I've struggled with that. Well, this is just similar to the notion that that we've talked about in the past with St. Cyril saying the same thing. He's just echoing, and this is a response to people who think that because you make a distinction, that therefore it's a division. So again, remember the dictum that making distinctions does not entail composition or division. Sometimes a distinction might entail composition. For example, we make a distinction between body and soul. In humans, body and soul is composite, right? It is a composite thing because it's a creation that is brought together when God creates us, right? We have a body, we have a soul. And so in humans, though, in the way that we actually are, it's united, right? The body suffuses the soul suffuses the body in the argumentation of many of the church fathers. So when we talk about making a distinction, right, and we say that it's a virtual distinction, that doesn't mean that the distinction isn't also real. It's in the context of, in theology, making the distinction, right? St. John Damascus makes the same argument in the Exposition of Orthodox Faith, where he says that just because we make a virtual distinction does not mean that we make a division. It also doesn't mean that there isn't a real distinction, right? So you can say both that there's a virtual distinction and a real distinction.
Yeah. Can I add something on that,
Sure.
Jay?
I'm going to pull up the paragraph that he's mentioning, but go ahead.
Yeah. This is relevant with Saint Kirill when he's talking about like the in two natures formula being acceptable. So for Saint Kirill, for example, if you make a distinction in concrete, it leads to Nestorianism because you're making a concrete distinction and you're separating them, right? And so he says that we make this distinction according to the eyes of the soul. Now, this doesn't mean a mere conceptual distinction inside our heads. This is still based on reality, but it is the way we understand a distinction is what is highlighted here. And this is exactly what the Chalcedonian definition, by the way, does when they say that Christ is in two natures. It says according to the intellect, which is exactly what St. Kirill says in his second letter to Socensus. So this claim that Chalcedon believes in Nestorian theology is patently false. It's absolutely false.
Yeah, I mean, if you couldn't make distinctions after the incarnation, which is what some of them argue, then you couldn't have John of Damascus having a whole chapter explaining what happens in the descent of Christ into Hades, because he makes all of these very precise distinctions about how the human soul was severed from the human body and descended into Hades, right? Does that mean that he's dividing Christ? Of course not. Is it a virtual distinction? Yes. Is it also a real distinction? Yes. So we don't have to set up either ors as if there's only one or the other. So I'll read 184. Different actions have different effects, not one effect, as was demonstrated by the example of the sword being hardened by fire. If the operation of the sword and that fire are mutually united, and yet we observe that the fire's effect is burning the iron, and the iron's effect is cutting, even though they are not distinguished in the burning cut or in the cutting burn, just as the effect of heaven or earth, then it is not possible to say that there is one work, unless there is only one action. If thou dost maintain that the effect of one energy is several distinct works by Christ, then thou must maintain one action. Or if thou dost teach an innumerable number of actions, then thou must also teach that the energies are innumerable. But our inquiry is not about the works, whether we're discussing things external to Christ, but about things within Christ himself, that is to say, about the natural principles of the essences of Christ, whether he remained defective from the union or not. If he was defective, then it is possible for a nature that is defective in a natural energy to genuinely exist. If it is not defective, then the energy is either understood to be a component or a principle of the essence, or it is acquired from those things external to him. If the energy is proper to nature, and it's not acquired from external sources, then it is possible for nature to exist then it is possible either for nature to exist without actions or the converse to be true. Nature can neither be conceived nor can exist without energies proper to it. To believe this is to believe that he operates in each nature naturally, and that there are not natures that are altered thereby. So I don't see, unless it's in a footnote, it's not 184. But again, just because, don't think in either or. So just because he says there's like we would say that there's a nature-person distinction in God, right? Does that mean we're dividing God because we make a distinction between nature and person? No. And so after the incarnation, can we still make conceptual distinctions about Christ? Absolutely. Does the fact that there's conceptual distinctions mean that he's blended in a Monophysite sense and that there aren't two natures still? No, because the union is hypostatic. It's in hypostatized. So hopefully that's helpful. Let's see. But if you want to put in the chat, because it's not 184, if you want to pick out the specific paragraph that you think it might be in where you're talking about, I can read that paragraph. Telegram, $5. Can you set your Telegram to public? It's on private. Nobody can find it, including potential people interested in Orthodoxy. Yeah, I'll have to do that. I didn't realize it was private. So I'll look in there and figure out how to do that. All right, so those are the super chats. I don't see if we got any more. We didn't have. I'm surprised we didn't have Orientals in here, like making arguments and claims.
Yeah, I kind of expected them, but maybe they'll do it on Facebook.
Yeah,
there's no one
people.
around.
Nobody wants to.
They do it all the
People.
time.
Yeah, people won't directly debate or interact. Everything has to do everything in some sort of like passive aggressive, shooting from the behind the screen. Like they won't just ever have a full on discussion or debate.
Yeah, a lot of people operate. That's why I decided to do the debate, because I said, this is the only guy that does it, so I might as well give him a chance, and I'll have a debate about this topic in 2 months. Hopefully, I'll give a better performance. I'll give it the best performance I can give during a debate. It's been a while since I did that, but shamelessly plugging myself in here again. If you like this stuff, if you want to see more of it, you can always follow my channel. You can, again, if you're interested about Calcutta, but you're not really interested about diaphysitism in the Church Fathers, you don't have to watch the videos in a chronological order. You can watch it anytime in any, like if you want to watch part 3 first and then part 2 and then part 1, that's fine. That's fine. So yeah, that's all I have to say, I think.
Awesome. All right, thank you guys. We'll have another stream tonight. Our friend Mark Hackard is coming back. We haven't talked to Mark in a long time, and he's put out some pretty bomb articles lately. Actually, one of them is out on the Jeff Stein Effrey stuff. So we're going to be discussing that tonight, espionage, geopolitics, with the expert Russia analyst Mark Hackard, geopolitical commentator analyst. You've seen him on RT and other sites. Soul of the East. And Mark is also putting out a new article as well on the controversial issue of Yuri Bezmenov. How do we understand and take the oft-cited Yuri Bezmenov talks? Well, we're going to be looking at that. We're going to be looking at defectors, espionage, geopolitics tonight when Mark Hackard joins me to discuss those topics. And but we're just crazy conspiracy theorists here. Like, we don't actually interview experts, people with graduate degrees in these topics. I didn't just write my master's thesis, most of it, on this topic. No, we're all just crazy conspiracy theorists. We don't actually know what we're talking about. There's no such thing as conspiracies. There's no espionage. There's nothing. None of this actually relates to the Orthodox world, even though now everybody knows it in relationship to the Ukraine and that situation. It's all fake. It's not real. Doesn't exist. And we're just crazy conspiracy theorists. Crazies. Well, we're going to get crazy tonight with Mark Hackard, so join me tonight, I think about, 8 or 9 Central, somewhere in there. I'll have the show page up here in a little bit. But thank you, David. Much appreciated.
Thank you, Jay.
All right. Everybody have a good night.